Nia thought her life was finally turning around. After years of working 2 jobs, saving every coin, she had managed to rent a tiny apartment in Lusaka. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She had her own key, her own space, her own peace for the first time in her life. Every night she would sit by the small window, sipping tea, feeling proud that she had built something for herself. But her happiness didn't last. One evening, her mother Miriam walked in unannounced, her pregnant sister Zanil following behind. At first, Nia thought they were just visiting, but it quickly turned into something else. Miriam looked around the little apartment and sneered, asking how Nia could be so selfish to keep such a place all to herself. Zanil sat quietly, rubbing her belly, while Miriam's words grew sharper. The word parasite slipped from her mother's lips, cutting deeper than anything else. Nia felt her chest tighten, but she kept silent, not wanting to cry in front of them. She waited for the storm to pass, but instead her mother gave her a cold ultimatum: leave on her own or be forced out. The walls that once felt like safety now felt like they were closing in. Nia wanted to scream that she had worked for this, that she had earned every brick of that apartment. But her voice stayed trapped in her throat. All she could do was watch as the dream she had fought for was already being taken away. The next morning, Nia woke up hoping maybe things would be different, maybe her mother would calm down, maybe it was all just anger that would pass. But the knock on her door told her otherwise. When she opened it, Miriam stood there, not alone this time, but with 2 men behind her. Before Nia could even ask what was happening, they stepped inside and started carrying out her things. Her clothes, her pots, her little desk, everything she had worked so hard to buy was being lifted out like trash. She wanted to scream, to fight, to grab her things back, but the coldness in her mother's eyes froze her. It was as if she wasn't even her daughter anymore, just some stranger being thrown out of her own home. She turned to Zanil, hoping for at least a word of comfort, but her sister only sat on the sofa, her hand stroking her round belly like she had already claimed the place as her kingdom. She didn't look at Nia with pity, only with a smug smile that said, "I've won." Nia's chest tightened as tears blurred her vision. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It felt like her family had cut her out completely, as if she didn't belong to them. Desperate, Nia begged her mother, asking why, asking how she could do this to her own child. But Miriam's face hardened even more. Family means sacrifice, she snapped, her voice loud and sharp, slicing through the room. You'll never understand that. Nia's lips trembled, but she said nothing. She wanted to answer, to defend herself, to remind her mother how many years she had sacrificed already, how many nights she had gone without sleep just to save enough for this small place. But she swallowed it all down. Her silence wasn't weakness. Behind it, something was building. Every insult, every betrayal, every piece of furniture tossed out the door was feeding a fire inside her. She realized in that moment that her mother's definition of sacrifice was obedience, giving up everything for others while receiving nothing in return. But Nia's idea of sacrifice was different. To her, sacrifice meant enduring pain now to build something stronger later. It meant giving up comfort today to secure freedom tomorrow. As the last box was dragged out, she stood in the empty room that no longer felt like hers. Her mother turned her back without another word. Zanil stretched out on the sofa, victorious, while Nia walked away with nothing but her bag and the pounding ache in her chest. Yet in her heart, she carried something they couldn't take, her will. They thought they had erased her, but they had only pushed her closer to the woman she was meant to become. Nia didn't know exactly how yet, but she knew one thing for certain: one day, she would return, not as the daughter they discarded, but as the woman they could never break. Nia left the apartment with nothing but a small bag and a heart heavy with pain. For days, she wandered the streets not knowing where she truly belonged. Finally, a kind friend offered her a corner in a cramped room. The space was so small that sometimes she slept on the floor, curled up against the wall, listening to the city outside. At night, when the lights were off and the world was quiet, the words of her mother came back to her like sharp knives. Parasite. Selfish. You'll never understand sacrifice. Each insult repeated in her mind, burning deeper every time. Some nights she cried softly into her pillow, her stomach growling with hunger because she barely had money for food. But instead of letting the pain destroy her, she let it feed something else inside her. One night, sitting on the floor with only a cheap pen and scraps of paper, Nia began to write. Not about her pain, but about her dreams. She had always loved sketching clothes since she was a girl, always imagining colors and shapes that could turn into something beautiful. Now, she poured herself into those sketches like her life depended on it. Dress after dress, design after design, she filled the papers with her vision. While the world thought she was broken, she was quietly building the first bricks of her future. Her mother and sister's voices echoed in her head, mocking her, calling her a parasite. But Nia smiled at the thought because she knew the truth: parasites take without giving, and she had never been that. She had worked for every single thing she owned. Now, even without a roof, she was still working. Only this time, she wasn't just surviving, she was planning. Every day, she saved whatever little money she could. She borrowed books from her friend about business, about fashion, about how people built something from nothing. She studied late into the night, her eyes heavy with sleep but her mind alive with ideas. She imagined her brand, her name on labels, her clothes walking down runways, her designs shining in shop windows. These weren't just dreams anymore. They were plans. Her hunger, her sleepless nights, her tears, all of it became fuel. Where others would have given up, Nia was sharpening herself like a blade. The betrayal that was meant to crush her was now shaping her into someone unstoppable. She promised herself that one day, she would not only rise, but she would rise so high that the same people who threw her out would have to look up to see her. And as she drifted to sleep in that tiny room, her stomach empty but her spirit burning, Nia whispered to herself, "This is not my end. This is my beginning." Nia walked into the investor pitch event with her heart racing, but her steps steady. She wasn't the broken girl her family had thrown out anymore. She was sharper, stronger, and hungry to prove herself. She carried her sketches in a worn folder, the same ones she had drawn during long nights on the floor of her friend's room. But now, those sketches were more than drawings, they were her future. As she stood in front of strangers in suits and dresses, she opened her folder and spread her designs on the table. For a moment, the room was silent, then heads began to lean closer. Eyes widened. Whispers filled the air. Her bold colors and sharp cuts weren't just clothes, they told a story of survival, of fire, of a woman who refused to die quietly. When Nia spoke, her voice carried a strength she hadn't known she had. She told them about her dream to build a brand that was African, powerful, and global. Every word came straight from her heart. She didn't beg for help, she demanded to be seen. And they saw her. By the time she finished, claps filled the hall, and an investor walked up to her with a smile. That night, she left with seed money in her pocket and a fire in her chest. What her family thought was her end had become the moment she was reborn. Quietly, she worked. She rented a small workshop, hired 2 young women who shared her passion, and stitched her dreams into reality. Her first clients were small, but they loved her work and told others. Soon, her designs began to reach the rich and powerful in Lusaka. Then came orders from Johannesburg, then Nairobi. Her clothes weren't just worn, they were celebrated. They started appearing on magazine covers, her name written in bold letters beneath photos of models in her designs. She didn't just build a business, she built an empire. While Zanil bragged about living in the apartment she had stolen, posing as if she had won, Nia was rising quietly and ruthlessly. Every stitch she sewed, every design she finished, every deal she signed was proof that her pain had turned into power. She never once called her family to show them her success, because she didn't need their approval anymore. They had tried to bury her, but instead, they had planted her. And now she was growing into something far greater than they could ever imagine. Nia's name was no longer whispered with pity but spoken with respect. She was no longer the daughter thrown out like trash. She had become the woman on fire, the designer who had turned betrayal into beauty, and pain into power. What was once her downfall had become her ruthless rebirth, and nothing could stop her now. Years passed, and Nia's name had become known in cities far beyond Lusaka. Her designs were no longer hidden in sketchbooks, they were walking across runways, shining in shop windows, and gracing magazine covers. She had built the life she once dreamed about on the floor of her friend's tiny room. But while her empire grew, the apartment that had once been stolen from her began to fall apart. Zenil and her husband, who had once sat smugly in that space, now faced bills they couldn't pay. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked when it rained, and the rent was months overdue. Creditors knocked on their door, demanding money they didn't have. The victory Zenil had once flaunted now tasted like dust. Miriam, who had once proudly thrown Nia out, now watched her second daughter sink deeper into debt. The pride in her voice was gone, replaced with worry and desperation. One evening, Miriam picked up the phone and dialed the number she had avoided for years. When Nia answered, her mother's voice was suddenly soft, almost sweet. "Family helps each other, right?" she asked, stretching each word as if sugar could cover the years of venom. Nia sat in silence, her mind traveling back to the night she was called a parasite, the morning her things were dragged out like garbage, the empty room that once held her dreams. She remembered it all with painful clarity, yet her voice remained calm. Her mother spoke on, explaining how hard things had become, how Zenil was struggling, how the family needed her. It was almost as if Miriam had forgotten every cruel word she had said, as if history could be erased with one polite request. But Nia knew better. She listened without interruption, letting her mother's words flow like a broken faucet, until finally, Miriam fell quiet, waiting for her to respond. In that silence, Nia felt something powerful. She realized she no longer carried the weight of their betrayal. She had outgrown the pain, outgrown the smallness of that apartment, outgrown the labels they tried to stick on her. She was no parasite. She had become a provider, not just for herself, but for the people she employed, for the young designers she mentored, for the community her brand now supported. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but steady, every word carrying the strength of the woman she had become. She didn't remind her mother of the past, she didn't scream, she didn't seek revenge. She simply said, "I remember." That was enough. Because the woman who had once been erased now held all the power. The daughter who was called selfish was now the one everyone needed. And the family who had thrown her away was learning the hardest truth of all: sometimes the parasite they tried to crush grows into the tree that gives shade to everyone else. Nia could have ignored the call. She could have hung up and walked away, leaving her mother and sister to drown in their own troubles. But instead, she chose to face the past head-on. Days later, she walked back into the same apartment that had once been ripped away from her. She didn't come carrying boxes of clothes or bags of food. She came dressed in quiet power, with lawyers at her side, contracts in her bag, and ownership papers tucked neatly under her arm. The apartment building had changed owners months before, and Nia had been the one to buy it. The place that had once been used to crush her was now hers. When she stepped inside, the air was thick with tension. Zenil sat in the living room, but the smug smile she had once worn so proudly was gone. Instead, her eyes darted nervously toward the papers in Nia's hands. Her hands fidgeted, her confidence crumbling as quickly as the walls around her. Miriam, who had once stood so tall while calling Nia a parasite, now struggled to find words. You own this place," she stammered, her voice shaky, her excuses already forming but dying in her throat. Nia's eyes didn't waver. She had no need to shout, no need to gloat. Her presence alone was enough to shift the entire room. She laid the documents on the same table where her mother had once given her the cruel ultimatum to leave or be forced out. The irony was so sharp it almost hurt to breathe. Miriam tried to soften her voice again, saying, "We are family, Nia, we can work this out, right?" But the pleading in her tone only revealed her fear. Zaniel's face was pale, panic written across every line. For the first time, the power was not in their hands, it was in Nia's. She didn't rush. She spoke slowly, carefully, letting every word sink into the silence of the room. She reminded them without anger, without drama, of the day she had been thrown out like a stranger. She told them she hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be erased, to beg for mercy and be denied. And now, she stood before them, not as the weak daughter they had once dismissed, but as the owner of the very place they had stolen. The neighbors outside had gathered, curious eyes peeking in, whispers spreading through the building. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Nia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The papers on the table spoke louder than any scream ever could. She had come prepared, and for the first time in years, her mother and sister were the ones left speechless. This was the return nobody expected. The girl they had tried to break now held the power to decide their future. The day Nia returned to the apartment was not just any day, it became the moment the whole neighborhood would never forget. Word spread quickly that something was happening, and soon neighbors stood outside, whispering and peeking in through open windows. Relatives who once sided with Miriam showed up too, curious to see why Nia had arrived with lawyers at her side. Even creditors who had been chasing Zaniel and her husband came, sensing that today would change everything. The living room was packed with eyes, ears, and heavy silence as Nia placed her papers on the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calmness alone demanded attention. She looked at her mother, then at her sister, who now sat nervously with her hands twisted together. Slowly, she picked up the eviction notice and laid it down on the same table where years ago her mother had delivered her cruel ultimatum. The room seemed to freeze. Everyone waited for her to speak, and when she did, her words cut deeper than any shout could. "You called me a parasite," she began, her voice steady, echoing into every corner of the apartment. "But parasites take without giving back. Look at me. I built everything I have from nothing while you tried to strip me of everything. I worked, I sacrificed, I fought through nights of hunger and days of pain. And today, I'm just giving you what you gave me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors covered their mouths in shock, others nodded quietly, remembering the day Nia had been thrown out like she was nothing. Miriam's face turned pale, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Zaniel looked at the notice on the table, her eyes wide with panic, the proud smile she once wore long gone. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. You could almost hear the weight of shame pressing down on the room. For once, it wasn't Nia who stood small and broken, it was Miriam and Zaniel. They were the ones cornered, the ones powerless, the ones with no escape. The very walls that had once been their shield now felt like they were closing in on them. Outside, whispers grew louder. People were already retelling the story, their voices carrying through the neighborhood. The daughter who was once called a parasite had returned as the owner, the provider, the one holding all the power. Nia didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply gathered her papers, nodded to her lawyers, and stepped aside. The eviction was final. What had once been her greatest humiliation was now her greatest victory. And the silence that filled the room that day would echo across the neighborhood for years to come. Everyone had seen it, Nia reclaiming not just an apartment, but her dignity, her power, and her name. As Miriam and Zaniel walked out of the apartment with their heads bowed and their dignity shattered, Nia stood still, watching them go. She did not cheer, she did not laugh, and she did not speak cruel words back. Her smile was quiet, but it wasn't the smile of revenge, it was the smile of survival. Years ago, they had called her a parasite, stripped her of her home, and tried to erase her. Today, she stood taller than she had ever been, not because she destroyed them, but because she had built herself into something greater than they could ever imagine. The same betrayal that once broke her had become her strength. The humiliation of being cast out had become the spark that lit her empire. People who had once pitied her now read her story in newspapers and magazines. Reporters called her the self-made designer who rose from nothing, her name shining next to pictures of her gowns worn by celebrities. But what the world didn't know was the depth of the fire that had forged her. Behind the beauty of her designs was pain, hunger, and a loneliness that she had transformed into power. Nia knew the truth better than anyone. She had survived the kind of cruelty that could have crushed her spirit forever. Instead, it had made her unstoppable. Her mother and sister tried to trap her in smallness, but she had broken free. They tried to reduce her to nothing, but she had become everything. And as she stood in the apartment that was once her prison, she realized the greatest victory wasn't the empire she built, it was her freedom. Because while they had chains of bitterness, she had wings of fire, and she would never be caged again.